Hi, welcome back, and this is Mark. We're going to talk about the evolution of Intel processors. A computer processor, or the central processing unit, is one of the most advanced piece of technology available in the market. Most calculations take place in the CPU. In terms of computing power, the CPU is the most important element of a computer system. The CPUs come in all sorts of form factors, and each style requiring a particular slot or socket on the motherboard. Types of Intel processors. For this particular session, we're going to talk about mainly on the Intel processors. Now, the term Intel is actually a corporation. The Intel Corporation is an American multinational corporation and technology company headquartered in Santa Clara, California, in Silicon Valley. It is the world's largest semiconductor chip manufacturer on the basis of revenue and is the developer of the x86 series of microprocessors, which are found in most personal computers. Now, the first in the history of Intel processors, it started way back 1971. In this was when Intel introduces this one, the first single chip CPU, the Intel 4004, and it is a 4-bit central processing unit released by Intel Corporation on November 15, 1971. This chipset had a clock speed of 200 kHz and had 2,300 transistors at the cost of $200. Next on the line is this chip, which was introduced in the 1972. This was the Intel 8008 and was an early byte-oriented microprocessor designed and manufactured by Intel and introduced in April 1972. It was an 8-bit CPU with zero point 0.2 MHz to a zero point 0.8 MHz clock speed. Next is during the 1974. This was the next chip that was introduced by Intel, and as you can see, it's a 8080 AS2010. It's the Intel 8080 and is now the second 8-bit microprocessor, which was released in April 1974. It was an extended and enhanced variant of the earlier 8008. Although without binary compatibility, the initial specified clock frequency limit was already 2 MHz. Next in line is during the 1976. This is now this chip. The Intel introduces the 8085, which is an 8-bit 5 MHz microprocessor with 6,500 transistors in March 1976. Now, next in line is during the 1978. This is the chip which is named as Intel 8086, which is a 16-bit microprocessor introduced on June 8, 1976, becoming the world's first x86 processor. This had a clock speed of 10 MHz and had 29,000 transistors. Next in line is during the 1984. It's this chip, the Intel AT286, is a 16-bit microprocessor released on February 1, 1982, becoming the first processor to be backwards compatible with the previous processors. This processor had a clock speed of 12 MHz and 134,000 transistors. Next is 1985. Now the Intel introduces the AT386 is now a 32-bit processor, 40 MHz processor with 275,000 transistors at a cost of $299 in October 1985. Next now is during the 1988, the Intel AT386SX processor, which was introduced in 1988 as a low-cost alternative to the original 386 processor. This version of 386 lacked many of its original features but still featured the 32-bit architecture and built-in multitasking with a 40 MHz speed. Next, in the 1991 is this chip. The Intel introduces the Intel 486SX processor, which is a 32-bit chip. And in this chip efforts to help and bring the lower cost processor to PC market. This processor now was selling for $258 with a 25 MHz clock speed. Now is the 1992. Next is 1992. The Intel releases the 486DX2 chip, which is a 33 MHz processor, on March the 2nd, with a clock doubling ability that generated higher operating speeds. Now in 1993, the Intel releases the first generation Pentium processors. This had a clock speed of 60 MHz with 3.1 million transistors on March 22, 1993. This processor was selling for $878. And in 1995, the Intel Pentium Pro, which was released in November 1995. This version of the Pentium processor had a clock speed of 200 MHz and a 5.5 million transistor. In 1997, Intel introduces the second generation of Pentium processors with a clock speed of 450 MHz on May 7, 1997. And in 1999, Intel releases the Celeron 366 MHz and a 400 MHz processors on January 4th. And Intel also releases the third generation Pentium 500 MHz, 550 MHz, and the 600 MHz processors. In year 2001, the fourth generation of Intel Pentium processors is released with a clock speed of 1.3 GHz. It's now the Intel Pentium 4. In 2002, Intel releases 1.3 GHz Celeron processor with a 100 MHz bus and 256 kilobytes of level 2 cache. On 2003, Intel Pentium M or Pentium Mobile is released. This was developed for laptops and it ran at a lower clock speed, which helped reduce overall energy usage. On 2006, Intel releases its Core 2 processor, which is a 64-bit. Using its Core 2 architecture, the Core 2 processors had a clock speed of 1.86 GHz and a 2.13 and a 1.66 GHz front-side bus and 167 billion transistors. The Core 2's performance and price made it popular with the consumers. Now, in the year 2008, Intel releases the i-series processors. It's the i3, the i5, and the i7 processors with clock speeds ranging from 2.13 GHz to 2.93 GHz and 731 million transistors. Intel also releases the Atom processors designed for netbooks and nettop with a clock speed of 1.86 GHz and 47 million transistors. Now for the future of central processing units, today both Intel and AMD have processors with support for quad-core, 6-core, and even 8-core processing with the option of hyper-threading technology. And most importantly is you have to remember the Moore's Law, which is a guide for us on how these processors are developing and are progressing over the years. According to Moore's Law, which is named after Gordon Moore, a co-founder of Intel, the number of micro components that could be placed in an integrated circuit, such as a processor, would double every year and would continue in the future. Here's a graph showing the transistors moved up in terms of numbers over the year. As you can see here on the right side, you have the transistors from 1000 to this part here, a 10 billion number of transistors, and over the development from 1970 to 2010. And as you can see here, there are started with Intel 404 and there are over 1,000. Okay, and then as you go up here, you have already a million, and over here on top you have a billion number of transistors already. Or these already are referring to the servers, Intel servers. Okay, that's just 2010. How much more today? We are in 2021. In the current world of computers, silicon is the most important element used in manufacturing computers' CPU. The silicon, which is the semiconducting element, forms the regular, near-perfect crystals into which chip makers can carve the hundreds of millions of features that make the microchips that power the processors. With the Moore's Law, it allowed chip makers to cut the size of those features in a half every year. However, if computers are to keep up with Moore's Law, chip makers will have to move beyond the silicon. At the moment, electric pathways, which are etched on the silicon, have met their ultimate miniature sizes. With this in mind, A new compound will have to be created to house the future architectures that make up a processor. From what we have seen in the history of computer processing, we can expect that the future of CPUs to include increasing clock speed, more cores, increased efficiency, and smaller form factors, which is, in the end, the processor will progress to become superior while older models shall be inferior compared to it. This ends our presentation on the evolution of the Intel processor. Thanks for listening. Have a nice day.